Hey everybody, welcome back to Reacteria. Today we're going to go back to our favorite series, Debunking Evolution with John and Jane by Genesis Apologetics. And today we're taking a look at their take on homologous structures, or as they call them, homological structures. And I'd just like to start this video by pointing out that I have never, in my entire life, ever heard the term homological structures. I texted several of my biologist friends from all around the country just in case there were like regional differences in vernacular, because that does happen sometimes. And none of them have ever heard the term homological structures either. I Googled it. It is a legitimate synonym for the phrase homologous, but when I looked at the literature, all I could find were papers on mathematics. I found several links to homological algebra, but I have never heard any biologist use the term homological ever. This isn't necessarily a criticism. It is a legitimate synonym, but to me, it just sounds like they were trying to sound smart in the title, so they just like made this weird word out of thin air. What a way to start a video where you're trying to debunk well-established science, then by naming it something so odd. But who knows? Despite not knowing the proper terminology, perhaps they actually have some legitimate criticisms to levy against the field of homology. But before we find out, you know I've got to thank my patrons on Patreon. Be sure to stick around to the end of the video to see a long list of some of the people in the upper tiers there. And also, the sponsor of today's video, I've got it right here. Check it out, y'all. It's NordVPN! Aww. The end of the year is approaching fast, which means you're probably shopping online more and more. So before you blindly enter your credit card information into some sketchy website to buy some weirdly specific gift for that special someone, be sure that your data is safe with NordVPN. NordVPN protects your info behind a wall of next-generation encryption. They mask your IP so that you can't be tracked online. And they even let you connect up to 6 different devices with one account, including mobile devices, which means you can visit 6 times as many dubious sites and buy 6 times as many bizarre Christmas presents. And the best part is, they're offering my subscribers an exclusive discount plus an additional 4 months free, all with a 30-day money-back guarantee when you go to nordvpn.com/ValkaiLabs. With over 5,400 servers in 60 different countries, Nord gives you worldwide access, so that you can see content that normally isn't available in your region. And if you're looking for gift ideas, you could always give somebody the gift of safe internet. Who doesn't want that, right? So use the link down in the description, or just head over to nordvpn.com/ValkaiLabs to sign up today. Remember, you get an exclusive discount plus an additional 4 months free, all with a 30-day money-back guarantee when you use my link. Thanks so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this video, and now let's see what John and Jane know about homology.
Is it just me, or is it impossible to line up animals in the way they evolved?
Then this one right there, this guy there, this one right next to that, just like that. That looks pretty good. Okay.
What's wrong, Jane?
I had the weirdest experience last night. I went to my friend Carrie's house. Her house looks just like mine. I went inside and I went into the living room, and it's the exact same shape and size as mine. Even the stairs are in the exact same place. It was such a freaky experience.
Jane, it's because you live in tract housing. They only make a few different house plans that they repeat throughout the whole neighborhood.
I never knew that.
Yeah, it reminds me of homologous structures.
Okay, so John and Jane know the word homologous, but the person who edits and names the video doesn't? I just don't understand how they could write and record a video using the correct terminology and then blow it on the title. Again, it's not really a solid criticism, so I'll let it go, but just it's so weird to me.
I was just studying it in our textbook. So, what's the term homo mean?
Homos is Greek for same.
Right, and logos means relation. So, homologous means having the same relation.
And that was in our textbook?
Yeah, no, it says right here in the biology book. Gracias.
De nada.
Ustedes dos realmente necesitan estudiar biología, al menos tanto como estudian español.
Homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry. That is, A similar structure in two organisms can be found in the common ancestor of the organisms.
Not sure I got all that.
Which part?
John, that was a 2-sentence definition that a lot of new learners struggle with. It is not that hard to repeat it, and there is no reason to be that creepy.
All of it.
Okay, look at the diagram.
So they say the penguin, alligator, bat, and human all evolved from a common vertebrate ancestor because they have similar bones in their forelimbs.
So this might seem overly nitpicky, but a lot of creationists strawman this, and I'm betting that they're about to as well. We don't say that they evolved from a common ancestor just because they share similar bone structures. The fact that they share similar bone structures is just one of many lines of evidence that all point in that direction. Many lines of evidence which include embryology, which is mentioned in the very next paragraph of your textbook.
So they look for these homologous structures to show an evolutionary relationship.
You got it. And they would look convincing, but look at the definition of homologous.
Homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry.
Sometimes we see structures with similar functions in creatures that don't come from a supposed common ancestor.
Got an example?
I do. A human and a squid eye.
So this is actually really important to point out, and that's why this is usually taught at the same time as homology in most introductory bio classes. Traits which look similar or have similar functions but don't share a direct common ancestor are called analogous traits. The eyes of cephalopods and mammals are a great example, as is wings, which evolved independently in insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals, all at different times. And that's why just a minute ago I made sure to point out that we don't say that things are related just because they look alike. The fact that they look alike is a good hint that they might share a common ancestor, but we need a lot more evidence than just that before we make such a big claim.
Both humans and squid have a lens that projects an image onto a retina. The problem is that evolutionary theory holds that the closest ancestor to both didn't have eyes, but only a patch of light-sensitive skin cells. That means that a very similar eye had to evolve twice, completely independent from each other. They call this convergent evolution and believe that the same process of random mutations happening over millions of years built similar structures.
No way! An eye's so amazing, it seems impossible that it could have evolved in the first place. But now they believe it happened twice?
Yep, that would be impossible. Times 2.
Okay, so there's a million problems with that whole segment. First of all, that was one of the crustiest looking eyes I've ever seen. Secondly, the diagram was very wrong. They put the human eye up here with the apes, which is correct, but then they put the cephalopod eye with the fish, which branch off really weirdly from the rest of the fish over here. Either way, cephalopods are mollusks. They're far more closely related to snails than fish, so that eye should really go down here. Third, they said that our common ancestor with octopi didn't have eyes, just a patch of light-sensitive cells. What do you think an eye is? It's a patch of cells which are sensitive to light, which may or may not be accompanied by other cells that help focus that light. We've talked a few times about the evolution of eyes on this channel, including during this series, but I just want to reiterate that the evolution of the eye is not a poorly understood or controversial thing in science in the slightest. You can still see many of the stages of eye evolution in living animals today, because remember, evolution is not a sentient agent with a plan. It couldn't have produced the complex eyes that humans and cephalopods have today through several generations of half-formed non-functional eyes. Each stage of eye evolution would have had to have been just a different kind of fully formed, fully functional eye that was useful to the organisms that possessed it. So you go from a simple eye spot, a patch of photosensitive cells which can tell the difference between light and dark, which we still see today in clams, to an eye cup which can tell the direction which light is coming in from, like we still see today in planarians, to a pinhole eye which enhances the resolution of the incoming image, like we still see today in nautili, to something with a lens to focus light against the retina, like we still see today in snails, all the way to a complex eye with a cornea and muscles for contracting the lens, like we see today in mammals. And that variety brings me to the next thing. They said that humans and squids have very similar eyes, which sounds like a reasonable thing to say in the broad sense, but when you get down to the fine details of it, you'll notice that there are several glaring differences. Just take a look at their own diagram, which shows the different directions of the nerve fibers, which gives cephalopods an everted retina as opposed to our inverted retina. Cephalopod eyes and insect eyes and tetrapod eyes do share a lot of similarities, but they're also all completely different in a variety of ways, and that's because they all evolved independently of one another. And there are lots of other different kinds of eyes all around the world, some of which we don't even think of as eyes. For example, the parietal eye that lots of lizards have on top of their head, which isn't useful for seeing shapes or colors, but can tell the difference between light and dark to help detect movement from a predator coming in from above, or to regulate the animal's body with day and night cycles. So when they throw around terms like very similar to try to cast doubt on the idea that such a specific structure could have evolved twice, it's important to remember that it didn't. Eyes are a super common sticking point for creationists. They either argue that they're too complex, or they're too specialized, or there just wasn't enough time for them to have evolved, but all of that is demonstrably untrue. And one of my favorite demonstrations of that is this study from back in 1994, where two researchers developed a model of eye evolution to see, theoretically, how long it would actually take for a complex eye to evolve over the course of 1,800 tiny improvements from a set of light-sensitive cells all the way up to a complex image-forming eye. Even with a consistently pessimistic approach, the time required becomes amazingly short, only a few 100,000 years. In fact, their actual estimations here show that it would take just around 360,000 generations, and that in the 550 million years since eyes first appeared in the fossil record, complex eyes could have evolved from scratch over and over again 1,500 times. And finally, eyes aside, there's actually lots of other examples of convergent evolution out there, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And I talk about that in episode 3 of The Light of Evolution. So I'm just going to play a little clip from that now. Take it away, past me. So now we understand that tiny mutations can have massive ramifications, and that complex structures are built upon complex genetic networks. But doesn't this all sound a bit like a just so story? Wouldn't it be a lot more convincing if the same kind of things evolved more than once to show that it wasn't all just a fluke? Yes, it would be a lot more believable if that happened. Also, that happens a lot. Complex adaptations evolve independently in completely unrelated species all the time. Evolution does repeat itself. Convergent evolution is the term for when two unrelated lineages converge on the same adaptations and evolve the same structures or behaviors independently of one another without sharing a common ancestor with those traits. Just look at Australia versus the rest of the world. Australia has been geographically isolated for 30 million years, and it took pretty much all of the marsupials with it. But even though the animals are very different, the ecological niches and selection pressures are largely the same, which leads to lots of different examples of convergent evolution. Mole, marsupial mole. Mouse, marsupial mouse. Anteater, numbat. Lemur, spotted cuscus. Flying squirrel, flying phalanger. Wolf, thylacine. Lion, Thylacoilio, which was a marsupial lion, which was the largest carnivorous mammal to ever live in Australia, which thankfully went extinct about 30,000 years ago. And speaking of Australian animals, convergent evolution can even work when the adaptation doesn't actually do the exact same thing, but it's similar enough to seem like it does. Let me explain. This is a blue-tongued skink. It's a lizard from Australia that has a bright blue tongue that it wags at predators to scare them away. Why would having a bright blue tongue scare away a predator? Because there are countless other species out there that use bright coloration to signal that they are poisonous. Bright coloration to indicate poison is an adaptation called aposematism. But blue-tongued skinks aren't actually poisonous. They just use their bright coloration to make predators think they are. So they converged on the adaptation of bright coloration without actually having the poison to go along with it. By the way, the phenomenon of a harmless species imitating a dangerous species is called Batesian mimicry, and it's one of my favorite things in evolution. Man, my old recording space was small. Look at this. Look what I can do now. Look at all this room for activities. Anyway, to get back to this video, Convergent Evolution does not go against homology. Eyes are not that special, and nothing that John and Jane have said so far casts any doubt on evolution in the slightest.
Are there other examples of similar looking organs that don't fit evolutionary trees?
Oh yeah, lots. Think about flight. Flight supposedly evolved at least 4 different times. Birds, insects, mammals, like bats, and reptilian flight, like pterodactyls.
Now that makes it 4 times impossible.
Just a little bit ago, I mentioned that flight has evolved multiple times independently in order to give an example of convergent evolution. And now, here we have John and Jane bringing up the exact same point as evidence for the impossibility of evolution. And that's something that I think is really interesting about these videos, is that they earnestly assert that evolution can't be real, and they continuously use evidence for evolution to try to back up that point. It's like if you gave 2 people a puzzle to solve. And person A starts clicking together pieces wherever they seem to fit, and slowly but surely, they start to see a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more of the image, and sometimes they break off and build a little something over here that doesn't really seem to fit, but then in time, they're able to connect the 2 parts and build a little bridge between them. And as they start to get a better understanding of the colors and the patterns and the shapes of the picture and understand a little bit more of what the whole big picture is, they're able to go hunting a little bit more efficiently for other pieces and build the puzzle a little bit faster and know where to look for different parts that go in different places. And meanwhile, person B goes into the puzzle assuming that they already know what the image is going to be, and so they throw out all the pieces that don't seem to fit that and accuse person A of being biased because they're only deriving their opinions and beliefs about the puzzle from the picture that they themselves are putting together. And how can they be so confident when they're changing their mind all the time? Every time they build a new section of the puzzle, they change their story on what the picture must be. Really, it must be person B that has it all figured out because they've always known what the puzzle is supposed to be. And you see that exact kind of thinking in this clip. They already believe that evolution is impossible, and they are dead set on not changing their minds on that. So they don't see new information like convergent evolution as evidence that things like eyes and wings and other complex advanced structures don't require miraculous conditions to come into being. Instead, they're seen as impossible times 2 and impossible times 4. They already know what the puzzle's supposed to look like, so any pieces that don't fit that image must be lies. And what's crazy to think about is that I know they would accuse me of behaving the same way because I'm willing to change my mind with new evidence. They've already said in other episodes of this series that they think evolution is a religion because they cannot conceptualize non-dogmatic thinking. It's horrifying to see, dude.
So, going back to the human and squid eye, would they be called homologous structures since they look similar?
Nope. When similar structures are found on creatures that aren't considered closely related, they are called convergent.
So calling the structures themselves convergent is kind of weird phrasing. It's much more likely that you just use a term like analogous in that context. But in case you're curious, there's actually a whole slew of words to describe structures and their relationships between different species that may or may not have them. There's synapomorphies, plesiomorphies, autapomorphies, apomorphies. All of these are terms that are used to describe structures as they pop up within a phylogeny. So for example, hair is an autapomorphy of mammals. It's a new, unique trait that separates them from their common ancestor. But within mammals, hair is a synapomorphy because it is a common trait that is shared among the whole taxa and the common ancestor. And because these terms are relational, they can get a little bit tricky. In that particular instance, synapomorphy and homolog, or homologous structure, are synonymous. But that isn't always the case. For example, if one group of mammals were to all lose their fur, you couldn't call that a homologous structure because there isn't a structure there. But the lack of fur could be called a synapomorphy because it's a shared trait amongst an entire clade and their common ancestor. Cool, right? Oh, and by the way, there's one of those relational terms that's used to describe characteristics within phylogenies that just is especially stupid. It's called a homoplasy. Guess what a homoplasy is? Is it like a homologue? A homologous structure? Something shared within a clade and their common ancestor? No, it's the exact opposite. A homoplasy is an analogous structure, the result of convergent evolution, something that you see in two different taxa that doesn't come from a common ancestor. Why? Who thought that was a good idea? So many students get hung up on that. It is so stupid, and I have no idea who made that dumb decision. Anyway, none of this matters. I'm going to make a whole video about these relational terms and what they mean later on. I just wanted to add some nutritional value to that last segment. All I'm saying is, if you want to study biology at the collegiate level, be prepared to be frustrated by that.
So how do you know the difference between when similar structures are homologous and when they're analogous?
Genetics and fossil records.
I'm not sure.
It's genetics and fossil records. You can tell how closely related two things are and whether or not their common ancestors shared a common trait through genetics and fossil records.
It says here, homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry. But how can anyone be sure that structures actually shared a common ancestry?
Genetics and fossil records.
When similarities fit evolution, they're homologous structures. But when they don't fit, they claim the structure evolved more than once?
No, it isn't when it fits or doesn't fit evolution. It's when the common ancestor did or didn't have the trait that you're talking about. And you can tell that by checking genetics and fossil records. There's a whole field called systematics, which is all about when different traits evolved and where different things fit on the evolutionary tree. And you don't get to ignore it just because you don't know about genetics and fossil records.
Wow, that's circular reasoning.
How so?
Their evolutionary theory decides what is homologous, and then they say homologous structures prove evolution.
Hey, that's right. That's really messed up.
I'll tell you what's messed up, John. It's somebody claiming to be able to debunk the cornerstone of all biological science without knowing what genetics and fossil records are.
So how do creationists explain similar structures?
Simple. They share the same master designer, God. God built similarly designed features into his creatures, making sure each feature was precisely tailored to fit that creature's systems.
Except they're not always precisely tailored. And often they have to change in response to their environment. As you guys pointed out in your episode about natural selection, where you tried to debunk evolution by describing evolution.
It's like airplanes, skateboards, cars, and motorcycles. They all need wheels and tires, but designers made them different to tailor them to each vehicle's unique specifications.
Guys, I swear to Glob, that's called technological evolution. It's not the same as biological evolution, but it is very comparable. Wheels and tires were developed first, and then they were modified to fit all those different vehicles as those vehicles themselves were developed. Similarly to how the bone structure of the limbs of tetrapods evolved first, and then was modified through further evolution to fit all sorts of different animals as those animals themselves evolved. See, you and I both can draw comparisons and build analogies, but only one of us has evidence on our side.
That sounds like Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6. You alone are the Lord. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and everything on it, the seas and all that is in them. And you preserve them all. The host of heaven worships you.
John and Jane end all of their videos like this by reciting some Bible passage that vaguely sounds like a point that they were trying to make. I don't think that the actors who play John and Jane are watching this video. I don't think that the people who produced the John and Jane series are watching this video. But I do know for sure, based on the comments and the emails and the letters that I received, that a lot of people who grew up watching things like John and Jane are watching this video. And if you're one of those people, I'd like you just to imagine for a second that I did the same thing. If I were to end every video with a passage from On the Origin of Species or something. Like, what if I were to make a whole video about how creationism is nonsense, offering no explanation or evidence of evolution whatsoever, just negative talking points about creationism, and then I ended that video with, it's just like it says here, in a brief history of time, and that's how we know that it's true. Would you see an issue with that? Because I would.
So how do creationists explain similar structures?
Simple. They share the same master designer, God.
That sounds like Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6.
So similar structures point back to a creative and intelligent God.
Wow, that's circular reasoning.
That's really messed up.
The fact of the matter is, you can't say that something is true just because it's written in a book that you like, no matter what that book is. You have to have actual evidence for what you're saying. And just repeating the claim in different ways is not evidence, nor is your lack of belief in or even the lack of evidence for a different claim. As I've said over and over again, even in the very first episode of this series, even if you could completely debunk evolution in its entirety, that would not be evidence for creationism. Certainly not for a God, and absolutely not for anything written in the Bible. Each individual claim has to stand on its own, and you have to have actual positive evidence for the claim that you are making for you to be able to reject the null hypothesis, which is always that you are wrong. In science, you never accept a hypothesis. You fail to reject it. The whole endeavor of science is trying to prove yourself wrong and only moving forward with an idea when you just can't do that anymore. So until you have done your due diligence of trying everything in your power to prove creationism wrong and not being able to do so, we are simply not on the same playing field.
So similar structures point back to a creative and intelligent God, not to the circular reasoning or random coincidences of evolution.
Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, Jane, it makes me think. It makes me think that I need to work a whole lot harder because there are still way too many people out there that believe the crap that you two say. Overall, I give this video a Science Teacher Challenge level 3 out of 10. If you already know this stuff, it's pretty easy. But the differences between things like homologous and analogous structures are a very common sticking point for a lot of new learners. So if you're somebody who's never taken an intro bio class or just a young person in general, this could seem like a legitimate challenge and sow a lot of doubt because they deliberately asked common questions and withheld information that clears up common misconceptions. And that's why I make these videos, to help people sort through creationist lies and not make the boneheaded decision to reject evolution. I already had these skulls in here. I didn't know what else to do with them. I've still got a couple of videos to put out this year, but I've also already got really big plans for videos coming out next year, so make sure that you're subscribed so you stay up to date on all that. Also, YouTube is one of those platforms where subscriber count actually does really matter and it makes a marked difference on video performance, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that button if you haven't already, it really would mean a lot to me. It's free, it's easy, and it makes my dreams come true, so please consider it. And with that, I'm Forrest Valkai. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. Please exit through the gift shop on your way out, pick up one of these sweet t-shirts. Have an awesome rest of your day, and never stop learning. Bye-bye!